Hello, this is Craig Hill, once again, in the third lecture on the Introduction to the New Testament for Youth Men Academy. We're going to be, now that we've already taken a look at some of the introduction to the New Testament as well as the history and background that lies behind the text of the New Testament, let's start looking at the text of the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, and as it bears witness to the life of Jesus. So as we do this, there's a tendency of which comes first. Do we produce a life of Jesus first, or do we look at the four Gospels first? And I think for us, what we want to do is we want to start by looking at the four Gospels. This is really the information that we would want to use in order to compile a life of Jesus. And there is some questions about what do we do? Like how much do we let each one of these speak on its own behalf? Because they all come from distinct angles, and they are recorded and remembered. This is the life of Jesus remembered, and they are remembered, the life of Jesus is remembered by these four distinct authors with distinct emphases. And so we want to look a little bit at each one of them and what they show. So, for example, Matthew, as a gospel, is organized around five major sermons or discourses of Jesus. So you've got the Sermon on the Mount, you've got the sending out of the 12, you've got the kingdom parables in chapter 10 or chapter 13. You have the kingdom community and those things that go with that, as well as the Olivet discourse in the latter part of the gospel. And each of these sermons is kind of a structural indicator that the author is finishing with one section, moving on to another. But this is how Matthew is writing his gospel. He also remembers Jesus particularly and wants to emphasize that Jesus is Messiah or Christ. And Christ is the Greek word, the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah, which the Hebrew word Messiah or Mashiach means the anointed one. And in Hebrew thought, the anointed one is the king. David is the anointed king. Saul is the anointed king. Solomon is the anointed king. And so anytime in the Old Testament or New Testament that you see the word Christ or Messiah, you need to think king. And Matthew is all about king. Jesus is king, the kingdom of God, and such like that. So there's a lot of talk about king and kingdom in Matthew. It has a very Jewish tone to it. There are over 129 quotes or allusions to the Old Testament. And again, these themes of kings, kingdoms, and with that, you have to think about authority, that Jesus has authority. And there's a big question, the Romans are here. Who has authority? And what about these Gentiles? What do we do with them? And you have this interesting, Matthew's going to paint this very interesting theme of a Jewish king, the Jewish Messiah comes, and from the get-go, with the Magi, you have these kind of shady foreigners, these shady Gentiles. They show up and they offer gifts to the king of Israel. They even get directions from the sitting king of Israel, Herod the Great, who then wants to kill this king. And then you have the issue at the end of Gentile inclusion. Well, whereas many of the Jews follow Jesus, but many of the Jewish authorities plot to kill him. And as he's hanging on a cross, you have the executioner, the Gentile executioner, this Roman centurion, and he says, truly, this was the Son of God. So at the very beginning of the book and at the very end of the book, you have this foreshadowing of this Gentile sensibility, this idea that God's anointed one is going to come, and he's not only going to appeal to the Jews who are there, but also to those that are outside of God's chosen people. So Matthew has its own distinct emphases here. Mark, rather than the teachings of Jesus, Mark is organized around the miracles of Jesus. Jesus is presented as this figure of Isaiah 42 and Isaiah 53 of the servant of the Lord, the servant of Yahweh, who is a redeemer. And one of the main statements in Mark is this ransom statement in Mark, that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And it is redeemers are the ones who come to pay ransom to free slaves. And so you have the servant of the Lord, who is a redeemer, who has come to ransom his people. A little bit of a different emphasis than a king. Certainly Mark would say Jesus is Messiah, but the emphasis for Mark is that Jesus is the servant of the Lord, a redeemer. Mark seems to be written maybe not as much to appeal to a Jewish audience as much to appeal to a Roman audience. A lot of action. Jesus is a, quote, a man of action in the Gospel of Mark. And the other interesting thing about Mark is all the information, all the parables, all the teachings, all the events in the Gospel of Mark, 93% of Mark is repeated in other Gospels, which has led this question of which Gospel comes first. Do Gospels borrow from each other when they write or compile? And it has led to the notion that maybe Mark is the earliest written of all the Gospels, and that other Gospels will use Mark in different ways to compile their narratives. So there's considerable debate about that, but if there is a consensus opinion, it is probably the idea that Mark is the earliest. As we keep going along, we look at Luke. Luke is organized not by sermons as much as geographical movement, that the issue of when Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, this is a major event in the Gospel of Luke, and it is a climax to the Gospel. So you have the outside of Jerusalem, you have Galilee, outside of Galilee, outside of Israel, and then into Jerusalem in this journey there. For Luke, Jesus is certainly he's the Messiah, and certainly he is the servant of the Lord, but he is really the Son of Man is going to be a main, this idea that Jesus is human, ideally human. And so the genealogy in Luke doesn't go back to Abraham as it does, or to David as it does in Matthew. It goes all the way back to Adam in the genealogy of Luke to show that Jesus is ideally human. Another thing about Luke is that Luke provides more parables than any other gospel. So there's a number of unique parables that are only in the Gospel of Luke, like the parable of the prodigal son is only in Luke. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus they are only in the Gospel of Luke. It's only there. So Luke is also one of the writers of the New Testament that really has a tone of really what is akin to Greco-Roman history or biography. Luke also writes Acts, and so Luke writes more like a Greco-Roman historian than any of the other Gospels. There is an emphasis on, with Luke, there's an emphasis on salvation, and salvation as particularly a reversal of fortune. So you read the Song of Mary as she finds out that she's going to bear the Messiah. She sings the song that send the rich away and let the lowly be lifted up, and this idea of reversal of fortune. And you're going to see that a lot in the Gospel of Luke, this idea that those who have might expect a certain fortune, that God will intervene on their behalf, and there will be a great reversal of fortune on their behalf, that God will bring low the proud and he will lift up the humble. Finally, John's an interesting gospel because it's not like the first three. The first three are what we might call synoptic gospels. They tell roughly the same events, the same narrative, the same timetable. John is unique. It is 93% of John is unique, as you can see here on this. And this has led for some to say maybe John is written later to supplement the traditions about Jesus that Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not tell. So John, rather than having the Lord's Supper words of institution, like this is my body, take and eat, this is my blood for you, or the blood of the new covenant, he doesn't have the words of institution at the Last Supper, but he does have the narrative about foot washing, that Jesus washes his disciples' feet. So it might be a supplementary gospel in that sense. It certainly tells its own story. There is no genealogy in John like you have in Matthew and Luke. John just starts with, hey, the Word was made flesh. Jesus was pre-existent, and that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, that Jesus is the divine Son of God. And John, of all the Gospels, might be the most accessible to Jews and Gentiles. There's a particular call to faith in John. John has this phrase at the end that Jesus has done many more things than these, but these things have been written that you might believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and believing you might have life. And so those are major themes in John: believing, life, Son of God. And you can see just how it's at the very top of this slide that the first half of the gospel is more about these 7 signs that he performs and his teachings. And then the last half of the gospel is about the last night of Jesus' life, the upper room discourse, these 3 chapters from 14 to 17, and then the passion narrative that comes after that. So those are the 4 gospels, and it is from these 4 gospels that we get a life of Jesus. And some people have done this kind of harmonizing, put it all together, and maybe we can harmonize all these. And I don't think that's the point that we're trying to look for when we read these gospels. We need to look at them as each its own work, its own work of literature that has its own emphases and is trying to do certain things and has some thematic development. So as much as we're going to walk through a life of Jesus and what roughly it might have looked like in terms of his historical life and what it might have looked like. But ultimately what we have is we have 4 distinct works of literature, and we want to give them their due and read them on their own. If we just take them and cut them up and put them into different, kind of harmonize them, then we lose the distinct theological and thematic emphases of the Gospels. So with that said, let us take a little bit of a look at what could be the life of Jesus. Now, the birth of Jesus, we don't know exactly when. Somewhere between 6 before the Common Era and maybe 3 BCE. So it doesn't actually hit 0 of the Common Era or 1 of the Common Era. It was later that they went back and looked at what is the year of our Lord, Anno Domini, or AD. But this is what we have. So 6 BC. The early part of Jesus' life, we don't have a lot of information. Only Matthew and Luke give us a birth narrative. Matthew tells the birth narrative from the perspective of Joseph, while Luke pays special attention to the perspective of Mary. You have Matthew also records the visit of the Magi and the flight to Egypt in Matthew chapter 2. Here we have this is what modern rural Bethlehem looks like today. Up here, so this is from the top of a fortress that Herod built, looking down on the fields. So shepherds could have been out in these fields. Jerusalem is up here, off in the distance, about 12 miles away, maybe 15 miles away or so. So this is modern Bethlehem. Only Matthew does record the visit of the Magi, but Luke is the one who records the shepherds out in the fields. Here's a picture of only Luke will record Jesus going to the temple when he is to be circumcised, and where Simeon and Anna greet them. And this is the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. The Wailing Wall is right over here, and this is the southwest corner. The Temple Mount is on the other side of this wall, which is today under Muslim control in the city of Jerusalem. And this area is an archaeological garden that is in the Jewish quarter of the city. So that gives us a little bit of a picture of what this could have looked like going forward. All right. As Jesus begins his ministry, every gospel is clear that he begins his ministry with some kind of relationship with John the Baptist. And all 4 of the gospels record a baptism in the Jordan, and this is the site of the traditional site of not only the crossing of the Jordan in the Old Testament into the Promised Land. Jericho would be only about 12 to 15 miles west of this spot, but this is the traditional spot. And then it is after that. So Jesus' relationship with John the Baptist, they both have a similar message, or the same message, which is the kingdom of God is at hand. And so Jesus, when he's baptized, that the Spirit comes upon him, and it seems as though he completely understands his identity and mission and starts to move out then from there into the wilderness. And this is the eastern slope of the essentially between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea is what we would call the wilderness, and this is what the wilderness would look like. It's desert, it's dry, there's not a lot of people, it's rocky terrain. This is the wilderness. So when we hear and you think about the wilderness, Jesus goes out into the wilderness. There's a number of caves up here there's hundreds of caves actually in this area in the wilderness, thousands of caves. And so maybe Jesus holes up in one of these caves or finds shelter or something like that, but that's where he's at in the wilderness. So that's early in Jesus' life. After Jesus understands what he's going to do and moves up out in ministry, the first thing we see in Mark chapter 1 is we see that Jesus begins and he goes out in ministry. In this area, this is in rural Galilee. This is kind of where he grows up. He grows up in Nazareth, which is just about 20 miles to the west of this, not as much on the lake, but he ends up in Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Chorazin. Let me zoom in here so we can see. So a number of things. This is from the top of Mount Arbel. It looks on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and you can see a little bit of the proximity of this. So down here is the town of Magdala, where Mary Magdalene would have been from. Right over here is Capernaum, where Jesus, it would have been understood that this is where Jesus grew up, or this is his hometown. Maybe a better way to put it, his hometown, where Peter is from. Over here is Bethsaida, and then up in the hills, up here is Chorazin. So this is all within about a 10-mile radius of each other. If Capernaum is the center, you're only looking at a few miles away that all of this takes place. And this is where 70 events in the ministry of Jesus take place in this area. Over on the far side of this is where the Man of the Tombs episode takes place. So anyway, you get a sense. The Sermon on the Mount, would take place like right up here. So it all happens right here. So when I was in Israel, I just showed up and I said, "Hey, look, people are expecting some teaching about what happened." I just said, "Look, Jesus used to live here. This is it. This is where he used to live. This is where his ministry took place primarily. This is the bulk of the episodes in the Gospels. This is where it happened." So this gives you a sense of that. As we move outside of those major events, we see that Jesus is going to travel outside of the region of Galilee. We're going to see that when he travels a little bit, down here is Jerusalem. We were just up here in Capernaum and standing on the top of Mount Arbel, looking up there. Jesus eventually will travel actually outside of Israel, up here to Caesarea and over here to Tyre, where he would meet the Syrophoenician woman. But as we zoom in to Caesarea Philippi, or not Caesarea Philippi, yeah, this is Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." This is a famous rock face at Caesarea Philippi where there would have been a temple to the god Pan. But some people think that there is a connection between this place being known as the gates of hell and this rock face, that Jesus is saying something about Peter and paganism and this authority. But all that to say, Jesus travels up here. This is where the confession of Peter takes place. It's not far away that he probably encounters the Syrophoenician woman. And the story is she begs Jesus and to come and heal her daughter. Jesus says, you don't throw the children's food to the dogs. And then she says, well, even the dogs eat from the crumbs of the table. And it seems that she has this special understanding of who Jesus is. And that this is in Matthew, where you have this theme of Gentile inclusion. And so a very important event in the life and ministry of Jesus here. So this gives us a sense of what we're looking at here. Eventually, after this time and after the transfiguration, we see the movement down on the way to Jerusalem. And as he moves to Jerusalem, he sends out the 72. He teaches primarily in parables, and he raises Lazarus from the dead. So here was Capernaum, up here is Caesarea Philippi. He moves down and moves into the region of Perea, Bethany beyond the Jordan, right down here. And before he moves up to Jerusalem, this is when he sends out the 72, like I said, raises Lazarus from the dead, as he begins to make his way to Jerusalem. Ultimately, the bulk of the Gospels material takes place during the last week of Jesus' life. It begins, and that material, and really this is about half of the Gospels, this last week of Jesus' life. So we get a sense of how important the Passion narrative is, these last words and last days of Jesus. You get the triumphal entry, which begins here on the top of the Mount of Olives. This is a picture from the Mount of the top of the Mount of the top of the Mount of Olives. These are all Jewish graves here. The Mount of Olives is particularly important in Jewish eschatology. In the prophet Zechariah, Zechariah says this is where the Lord lands to fight for his people. And so Jesus kind of enacts this prophecy by going down this road, down this path, and he eventually makes it to these gates, what's known as the Golden Gate, the eastern gate that leads into the Temple Mount. Now, this is the Dome of the Rock, which sits on what is presumably the Temple Mount today, and it's a Muslim holy site. And these gates, the Golden Gates, have been sealed, but this would have been where Jesus would have entered. The Garden of Gethsemane is right down here. So you get a sense of this is where Jesus would have, every day he would have come in through these gates, and every night of the last week he would have exited through these gates, and he probably would have stayed in Gethsemane right down here. And then he would have gone back in during the day. So this is a good shot of the city of Jerusalem. This dome over here is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the traditional site of the crucifixion. But this is kind of the money shot as you look over Jerusalem. So as we look back over here, this last day, he goes into the temple, he cleanses the temple, or he gives the disturbance in the temple. He has a conflict with the Sadducees, the Last Supper, the time in Gethsemane, the capture and the trial, and then ultimately the crucifixion. Here is, if we can zoom in here, here is a spot. We've seen that. This is the traditional site of the Garden of Gethsemane. This is a very old olive tree, although probably not old enough to be around when Jesus was around. But this is a site that many people have visited for Gethsemane. After the death and the crucifixion and death, then you have the resurrection, Mary Magdalene at the tomb. You have the account of the road to Emmaus, which is just south of Jerusalem or west of Jerusalem. You have the appearance to the disciples without Thomas, but then two with Thomas. And then you have the reinstatement of Peter in Galilee. This beach right here is the traditional spot of Tabgha, which is the traditional spot of the reinstatement of Peter. And actually there's a pretty good historical evidence that this is actually the spot, because there are some hot springs over here, and the fishing and whatnot all takes place here. So here are some examples of some college students having some time of reflection on Peter's reinstatement. So this gives us a little bit of the life of Jesus, and as we get it from the four Gospels, but these are some things that you can chew on as you look at the four Gospels and you think about the life and ministry of Jesus.